Okay, now we're back for part three of the lecture today. And as I was saying at the end of the previous section, we're going to be focusing on regionalism. And essentially, by this point in the lecture, you could be forgiven for thinking that globalization is a very kind of top-down process and that it is instigated and propelled forward by countries within the global north, by the governments, nation states in those countries, by transnational, multinational corporations. And I guess that's true to an extent, but that really neglects some of the complexities, some of the ways in which specific groups of countries within regions are involved in their own forms of globalization. It also neglects the way in which globalization is also relevant for and affecting countries within the global south in a way that extends beyond just being impacted by the increased flow of materials from the global north and extraction of labor and raw goods and increasingly manufacturing by countries within the global north. And so the next thing that I'd like to speak to you about is regionalism and globalization. So regionalism refers to essentially countries within a specific geographic region working together or a kind of focus of economic and political power within that region, rather than viewing power and economic flows in a full kind of global sense. Regionalism refers to a focus just on a specific region. So an example of that, which we're going to use today, would be the Asia Pacific region that we're in Australia part of. So since the 1980s, there's been something of a resurgence in regionalism, and we can track this through the quite widespread growth of regional trade agreements. So APEC, the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, is a particularly good example of this. It's expanded quite a lot over the decades, and it now accounts for about 50% of global GDP. So it's absolutely enormous, but it really is focused on relationships and kind of trade agreements and a kind of global openness within a specific geographical region. And so there's many reasons why countries would take part in these types of regional agreements, would kind of be part of this growth of regionalism. Largely this is to do with the kind of economic benefits that they have, and also kind of an effort to counteract the dangers of isolationism, the dangers of trying to compete and interact in a global marketplace as just an individual state rather than a group of states. So regionalism essentially allows smaller nations to rely on those around them, especially large nations around them, and build themselves up economically, politically, even socially, without the threat of having essentially full free market values imposed on them as individuals. So it gives them a bit of protection. It allows them to kind of work together. And also, crucially, regionalism can counteract or even slow down the huge impact of social and cultural globalization. So having regional bodies and regional organizations can be a way of protecting cultural identities in a world that's increasingly what we could say Americanized due to globalization. So, for instance, the Arab League protects the cultural identity of that specific region. We can also view the European Union as a great example of that, as a regional bloc, which is kind of tying together the economies of lots of European countries. And up until very recently, there was a very free movement of people within the European Union. And essentially, by grouping together, these countries can increase the bargaining power that they have. So as an economic bloc, such as the European Union, or as a group of countries that have a kind of trade agreement like the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, APEC, they can together bargain with really large countries and with other regional economic groupings, and therefore increase their clout, increase their bargaining power. So it's a way of essentially protecting countries. And so going on from especially what I was saying about the kind of social and cultural globalization happening here, and especially the way in which these economic blocks can, or these this kind of regional blocks can try to essentially manage the cultural and economic forces of globalization, it's really important to keep in mind, although we talk about Americanization, we talk about cultural imperialism, we talk about the spread of all of these kind of cultural ideas and these products, especially from countries in the global north, especially America. It's not necessarily true that there's a single controlling cultural force in the world. For instance, back in the mid-90s, Appendurai, a kind of theorist of cultural globalization, argued that the United States is no longer the puppeteer of a world system of images. And these images, these forms of symbolic production are coming from other parts of the world as well. We have other forms of symbolic production. We have other images and forms of communication. We have other products that are increasingly globalized, spreading all over the world, that are located not just within American cultures, but elsewhere. So we can think about, the fact that, yes, we still all watch a lot of Hollywood movies, but we also consume culture from other places. So I've got some examples here. We can think of Kung Fu movies, and especially like kind of Chinese, Japanese cinema. We can also think about manga coming from Japan, which has seen enormous uptake outside of Japan and is something that we all, at least know the name of. So that's an incredibly successful form of cultural globalization. We can think about South American soap operas, the telenovelas that a lot of people watch, especially there's a kind of global diaspora of Spanish-speaking people who are watching these all over the world. We can think about certain images and representations, such as this one that was kind of doing the rounds online a few years ago. We can think of Bollywood especially. So Bollywood has enormous reach outside of India. So of course, Bollywood films are, the primary market is within India, but there's also a huge Indian diaspora around the world consuming Bollywood products, and there's interest outside that diaspora as well. So Bollywood is increasingly globalized. We also have even the Mari Haka. So we now know, you'd have a sense of what this is, and it's something. If you go to New Zealand, you might go and see people perform this. It's a kind of recognizable form of culture that has a lot of traction outside of its place of origin, and it's something that we all recognize. It's a kind of form of culture that's globalized. So earlier in this lecture, in the kind of second part, I was speaking to you about some theorists of globalization, and I wanted to add one more here. So this is Raewyn Connell, and you came across Connell I think I mentioned her in the week on theory in week 2, and you definitely came across her in week 3 on gender and sexuality. So Connell is the author that talks about hegemonic masculinity. She's an Australian sociologist, and is a very well-known sociologist, a bit of a kind of national treasure of Australian sociology. And she's also written on what she calls Southern theory. So essentially, Connell argues that, well, this is kind of meta in a way, because Connell essentially argues that the shaping of the discipline of sociology and many, many other disciplines, but it's sociology that she's focusing on in particular, she argues that it's been shaped by the concerns and priorities of particular Western metropolitan centres. So historically Europe, and increasingly the United States, and Australia to some extent, and that this essentially overlooks the experiences of those living outside of these regions, and living in non-Western countries and ex-colonies, in other words, what's been called the Global South. And so Connell, she essentially argues that there is really important knowledge that's created historically and at present in what we can call the Global South that doesn't really get full acknowledgement in historical sociology and also in our contemporary work. And she argues that theorists from the global north, so theorists such as Giddens and Bourdieu, represent the world and represent globalization from a specifically northern metropole perspective. And she essentially tries to show how social theory about the modern world that comes from public intellectuals in peripheral societies is equal in intellectual rigor and often of somewhat greater political relevance to our kind of changing contemporary world, because this work accurately reflects the experiences of many people rather than numerically few, the kind of minority that dominate the Western intellectual sphere. So Connell's work is, I think, a really important contribution to social theory in general, and especially in a week where we're talking about globalization. You might think when we talk about the globalization of things, of people, that there's a very open flow of people, goods, money, ideas around the world. But the way in which especially ideas and information flows is not always equal. And I think Connell's work shows this in a really interesting way, that especially in contemporary times where we're trying to some extent make reparations and not kind of work within the colonial ideologies and such, we still don't always fully acknowledge the value of work being conducted in the global south. So I think this is an interesting and important inclusion in a week where we're talking about globalization, because it is important to think about the global flow of academic ideas. And when we're thinking about the kind of flow of ideas, the flow of information, we can also think about global social movements. So this is a particularly interesting example, I think. So I've put here the cover of a relatively recent book by Manuel Castells, who I was speaking to you about a bit earlier, the author of the work on the Network Society, who's interested in flows of information. He has recently turned his attention and his conceptualizing around flows of information to focus on social movements. So he's particularly interested in how new types of social media facilitate social movements, which may have been more difficult to organize and to keep together in previous times. He was particularly interested in the Arab Spring, things like the Tunisian Revolution, the Icelandic Revolution, in which a new constitution was crowdsourced, essentially, something that's perhaps possible in a country with 300,000 people, but less feasible in a much larger country. So essentially, Castells is interested in what social movements look like in a very interconnected, globalized context. And so we can apply this type of lens, this type of focus on the developments within social movements that are facilitated by social media to a range of social movements. But some that come to mind are recent movements around climate change. So I think especially the Friday for Future, the school protests, and all of those types of climate change movements. They are organized almost exclusively online. They are coordinated online. They make tremendous use of social media platforms, and they would perhaps not be manifest in a particular form if they weren't online. And we now have some of the proponents of these movements who are still doing the school strikes and still have their pickets and such, and are doing a virtual version of this because they're no longer able to gather in a whole, enormous group of people. That would just be a terrible risk at this point. So we have that particular example. Another one that immediately comes to mind, which is a really applicable one for looking at the role of social media and the flow of information facilitating social movements, is Occupy Wall Street. And in a way, this is interesting because it's kind of an anti-capitalist and thus anti-globalization movement in a way. So I think, and we also have, I think it's really important to consider when we talk about social movements that we don't just focus on those that we may be sympathetic with. We can also see the growth of like far right kind of anti-immigration and Islamophobic movements. And as much as we may disagree with these movements, I think it's important to consider that they're facilitated in the same ways. They're developing from the same affordances of technology and such. So they do kind of exist within this similar world. And so finally, we can start to think about kind of going off or thinking from what I was saying about the Occupy movement. We can start to think about the ways in which there are increasing movements against globalization in many cases. So after we've had decades and decades now of deepening globalization, interconnection, and all of these sorts of things, but more recently we've had in many cases a return to national identity and a rise of nationalist ideas. We've had independence referendums from various countries. We've had secessionist movements. We've had new states attempt to form. We have campaigns for stronger national sovereignty. So essentially, local and national boundaries have remained relevant because they are the kind of front lines on which many resistance battles are fought. And some particularly, I think, interesting examples of this are, Brexit is a huge one that comes to mind. So the European Union was, for many people, the kind of future of, of economic, like regionalist kind of economic organization. So, they're incredibly interconnected, and incredible freedom of movement, incredibly interconnected kind of economic systems. And in many ways, there were strong cultural and social interconnections as well. So essentially, Brexit is a really kind of watershed anti-globalization moment. We can also see the election of Donald Trump as a very anti-globalization moment in a lot of ways. And even during the last US election and the run-up to the US election, there was a lot of kind of anti-globalization, like very strong kind of nationalistic sentiment. So I think we can think about that by considering Donald Trump's economic protectionism. His idea of make America great again is very much like putting America first, which is another one of his slogans, America first, and not really thinking about interconnections with the rest of the world. So we can contrast that with someone like Hillary Clinton, who had a very strong orientation towards foreign policy. Trump doesn't necessarily have a very strong orientation towards foreign policy. He's very focused on the US economy, essentially, the US, how the economy is doing. And we could see that as well in some of the politics of even someone like Bernie Sanders, who is a kind of left-wing hero for many, but also had a very economically protectionist stance in many ways. So was a proponent of bringing more manufacturing back to the US and having less global interconnection in many ways. So I think Brexit and the recent US election and the kind of following presidency of Donald Trump are really, really interesting developments in a kind of anti-globalization, a return to nationalism, or a movement back to focus increasingly on national identity. And so at the same time as this, we can see there's equally a kind of growth of global identity politics. And we can see that in the image that I had from the Reclaim Australia rallies. So those particular rallies, until you start to see some of the kind of iconography and such, and like they kind of look like any other protest. I remember once I went up to Cairns for a conference and I was trying to find my hotel, and I was walking through a park and I found myself in the middle of some kind of protest or something. And I thought like, oh, this is probably like a kind of climate thing. That's great. Maybe I'll hang around for a bit. And then I looked up and I was like, nope, it's a Reclaim Australia rally. Leave, leave, leave. And so it did take a little while to figure out what exactly I'd stumbled into the middle of. So anyway, returning to global identity politics, essentially, we can see that in many ways, the human world is incredibly strongly integrated, but this hasn't necessarily led to a single culture, a single social, a single economic system. It's an interconnection, but there are also reactions to this. There's also the rise of identity politics aimed to restore traditions, restore fundamentalist religious beliefs and ways of life, and restore a commitment to ethnic and national identities. And in some negative ways, we can see a rise of xenophobia, Islamophobia, populism, alt-right movements as essentially a huge part of this. So this is really interesting that globalization and an increasing global interconnectedness is creating in many ways what we could think of as a backlash. And this is something that's really, I think, important for sociologists to be considering, and something that many sociologists are considering. So it's a really interesting space in which some great contemporary sociological work is being done. So I'm just going to take you through some concluding points, but please keep in mind this is not the final part of this lecture. So I thought I'd take you through kind of what I had planned for the lecture, and then as a part 4, I thought I'd take some time to just talk to you a little bit about what kind of globalization, or what the current COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic might mean for globalization, and talk to you a bit about some very recent work that's coming out trying to grapple with this. Because I think when we talk about globalization, as I was saying at the start of the lecture this week, this is really the elephant in the room. So I think it would be potentially interesting for all of us. So please do watch part 4. But just to conclude what I've been talking about so far and give you a summary of some key points to keep in mind. Essentially, sociologists generally understand globalization as involving an increased flow of economic, cultural, social, and political an increased interconnection of economic, cultural, social, and political spheres of society, an increased flow of people, ideas, goods, services, all sorts of things all over the globe. It really means an increasing integration of nations, of regions, of communities. And in an economic sense, it refers to, in many ways, the expansion of a capitalist logic and system, which it brings us all into a global economy. It's very interconnected, and we can see just how interconnected that is by thinking of the financial crisis, and we can see how interconnected our economic system is now by looking at what's happening to it in the face of a very unexpected event. And then culturally, we can look at the way in which the globalization has encouraged the spread and global integration of ideas, values, norms, behaviors, ways of life, and the ways in which, aspects of culture, images, forms of culture are increasingly recognized all over the globe. And then finally, politically, globalization refers to the development of forms of governance on a global scale. So this is rules and policies that nations are expected to abide by. So we can think of the UN as an international regulatory body. There are many other examples. We have international law. So political globalization is really seen through these organizations. Again, rather than regional organizations, these are global organizations that hold states accountable, that help states to work together, that help us to identify, for instance, human rights abuses. And so these three aspects of globalization are in many cases fueled by technological developments. So if we return to the work of David Harvey, the work of Manuel Castells, we can see, new communication technologies, especially social media. We can see new transport technologies. They've all really facilitated these incredible processes of globalization that we now see, and they facilitated the globalization that has cultural, political, and economic consequences. So I'll leave that there for now, and then I'll return and speak to you for the final part 4 of this lecture about globalization and the current context that we find ourselves in, and try and talk a bit about some of the recent work that that's coming out about this.